Hello and welcome to another episode of the Transportation Exchange podcast presented by Rush Trucks in Canada. I'm your host, Jason Cuddy, and on today's episode, we welcome Al Smith, who's a regional manager for Western Ontario of Thermo King Eastern Canada. Al, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jason. Very pleased to be here to talk about APUs for Thermo King Eastern Canada.
Yeah, so we wanted to have you on, kind of give us a little bit of history of the APU and your involvement with it, which until we kind of had a chance to chat, I didn't realize how extensive it was. And I think it's a really cool story to share with everyone. So I know there's some good stuff in there. So I think we would just jump right into it and start with, I guess, how you got into the industry, which then led you to the APUs.
Yeah, Jason. So my history with APUs really started when I joined the Canadian Coast Guard after high school in 1983. And I had sort of four basic takeaways. And the first one was from the Coast Guard because I spent a lot of time around diesel engines. And the first takeaway was that diesel engines are pretty inefficient. And we had the rule of thirds there, which meant that you lose a third of the energy through the exhaust. So every time you pass a gallon of diesel through an engine, you use a third through the exhaust, a third into the coolant system, and only a third of the energy is converted to do the work.
Crazy.
Yeah. So the second thing I learned was how difficult and how detrimental idling is to diesels. So one of the things that we learned was that if you idle an engine, you're running it cold, and because you're running it cold, you get a rich fuel-air mixture. And also because you're running it cold, the piston rings are contracted against the piston, and that increases the gap between the ring and the liner. Gotcha. And because of that, you get what's known as blow-by. Huh. And blow-by then basically has that rich mixture of fuel, and you get wet stacking between the piston and the cylinder liner. And the other thing you get is the fuel running down into the sump, and that makes an acidic mixture and is not good for the engine. So idling was a no-no and should be a no-no. The other thing I learned about was cogeneration. And cogeneration is when you interconnect two diesel engines through their coolant system. And you can grab some of the 1/3 of energy that's rejected into the coolant to warm up a second engine. And then the final takeaway from Coast Guard was this idea of mission ready. Right. And, the way it was explained to me was that we have two major assets on the ship. And the first major asset is that diesel engine. It's a 2,500 horsepower engine. And we don't take any risks with it. It's literally a life and death situation if it doesn't function. So we use a co-generator, and we use the smaller 200 horsepower engine to keep that main engine warm and to charge the batteries and to make sure that when duty calls, we're ready to go.
Gotcha.
Okay. The second major asset is the crew. And we use this smaller APU to provide you with creature comforts, to make sure that you're comfortable, to make sure that we power all of our equipment. And we can do that with 200 horsepower, not 2,500 horsepower.
Gotcha.
And so those were the things that stuck with me really through my career, those 4 points. So the next big moment for me was when I graduated from Fanshawe College, and I went to my manufacturing technology, went to my first job interview with a gentleman whom I consider to be the grandfather of APUs in North America. His name was Chris Gottmal. And Chris was very interesting. He was a mechanical engineer from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And Chris was also an ex-Swedish submarine captain. Mm. So a half-hour interview turned into a 2-hour conversation about, efficiency of engines, about the evils of idling, about cogeneration, being mission ready. And he added the idea of APUs for the North American trucking industry.
Right.
So long story short, he hired me, and, that set off on a 10-year journey of, he was a great mentor for me. I learned a lot. And, one of my first jobs for that company was to go to the Mid-America Truck Show and try to learn about idling and the trucking industry and the size of the market. And here's what I learned. I learned that there was this is 1990, about a million class 7 and 8 trucks on the highway. About 50% of them were sleepers, so 500,000 trucks. They do 120,000 miles a year, and at that time they were doing between 5 and 6 miles per gallon. And that the owner-operators and the fleets, the long-haul fleets, were idling between 8 and 10 hours a night, and they were doing that 200 to 250 nights a year.
Wild.
Yeah. So pretty quickly you get, conservatively, we were looking at 2,000 hours of idle time a year. And also the mechanical engines at that time were consuming 2 gallons of diesel an hour.
Wow.
So if you do the math on that, and the cost of diesel at that time was around $1 a gallon.
That part's okay.
Yeah. Changed somewhat since then.
Slightly.
Right. But, if you do the quick math, it's, you're basically talking about 2,000 hours times 2 gallons times $1 a gallon's $4,000 a year.
Yeah.
And over a 4 or 5 year truck life cycle, it was $16,000 to $20,000.
Wild.
And if you're trying to get a sense of the overall market, 500,000 trucks times $4,000 a year was a $2 billion market.
Yeah, it adds up fast.
It adds up fast. And then there was another number being floated around the truck show at that time, and that was 22.2 pounds of carbon monoxide in every unburnt gallon of diesel.
Wow.
That number was put out by the U.S. Department of Energy. And when you do the math on that, we weren't really sure what it meant at the time, but if you do the math on that, 2 billion gallons times 22 pounds is 44 billion. If you divide it by, they talk metric tons, and that, it's still 20 million tons of CO2.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Especially by today's standards.
Yeah. So we came back from that show thinking, clearly there's a substantial market. We were pretty excited about that. But that's when the hard part began.
Yeah.
And that was trying to decide what a unit should look like and what size it should be. And, a lot of questions. Should it be 1 cylinder, 2 cylinder, 3 cylinders? How much weight can it be? What's the frame rail space? How much power do truckers need in the back of their trucks? 3, 4, 5, 6 kilowatts. What's required? There were none of these answers were available at the time, right? How much heat for the sleeper? How much heat for the truck should we be putting into the truck? How big should the AC be? And over the course of the next 10 years, we tried them all.
Right.
And the AC was the more difficult piece, and because warm air rises, so you can get good distribution through a sleeper, but cold air wants to stay on the floor.
Yeah. So
we started with 6. We went to Canadian Tire to get an idea of what a house air conditioner, so a 10 by 12 room, required 6,000 BTUs. And that was kind of standard for the industry. So we thought it's a good place to start. And a sleeper is probably smaller. But over the years, we went from 6 to 8 to 10. And then finally, we decided on 12,000 BTUs.
Wild.
Yeah. More questions, right? What conditions was it going to be under? We have the, in Canada or in North America, we go from negative 40 to plus 20.
Yeah.
Right. Our first brochure said from the Yukon to the Yucatan Peninsula. So, we didn't really know what that meant. Chris had come from Europe, and, he was thinking that trucks went out for one night a week and were home most of the times because of the
smaller footprint geography.
Right. Yeah, the boundaries, and they couldn't get past the borders and that sort of stuff. So when we learned that our guys were out for 6 days and home, it changed the game. It changed the thinking. And, it was really the most difficult thing in developing an APU was sort of dealing with those extremes. And, those were, as I mentioned, learning years. And, we learned about the temperature, obviously. We learned about magnesium and calcium chloride that they were putting on the roads. What would that do year 2, year 3, year 4?
Yeah, good point.
Which we found out the hard way.
Yeah.
Right? So, the other thing was that in the spring and the fall in Canada and North America, because of the thaw and the rain and the tires, you were putting this APU in a place that was, certainly under a mist and practically underwater.
Gotcha.
So from electric perspective, there were a lot of challenges and a lot of things we didn't anticipate. So we sort of arrived at the end of the decade with a unit that we felt pretty, 2-cylinder diesel unit that was providing 12,000 BTUs of cooling and, heating the block and charging the batteries and providing power for the sleeper. But unfortunately, we hit the sort of downturn of the market in 98, 99. Mm-hmm. And so at that point, we realized that more resources were going to be needed. We hadn't even addressed the challenges of distribution.
Great, getting it out to everyone.
Getting it out to the marketplace.
Yeah.
And, serviceability, that sort of stuff, how we really hadn't addressed it. So Chris made the decision to sell off the truck side of his business and sold it off to a really excellent division, a Canadian division of an American company that took it on and carried it for, they're still in the industry today and doing fairly well.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. So the next big moment was 2005. And 2005 was important in the development of APUs for quite a number of reasons. And the first reason was that a major engine manufacturer at that time entered the 14-liter market with an electronic engine. Mm. And 14 liters where Class 8 trucks hang out. Yep. And that was a complete game changer. It was a concern at first because we learned that these electronic engines actually reduced the fuel consumption at idle from 2 gallons an hour down to about 1 gallon an hour. So that was going to play with the ROI, we thought. However, if you go back to 2005, you'll see that the price of diesel had tripled.
Gotcha.
It's got to $3 a gallon. So now we were $6,000 a year. Right. So it didn't really hurt the ROI. In fact, it helped the ROI. But the key thing was that fleets could now do a download and they could see their idle.
Yeah, that becomes a little bit different when you can, you know what's happening, right? It's standard, but you can actually see what's happening.
You can see it. And, for years I would go into fleet maintenance managers and I would say, how much do you think you idle? And they would say, 25. It's a lot, probably 25, 30%, something like that. And, oftentimes the math didn't work out, right? When they guessed what their idle time was. But now there was no getting around it. And they were doing downloads, major, large fleets, and they were finding 45, 50, 55% idle times.
Wild.
Yeah. So actually idling more than they ran the truck.
Yeah.
Right? And so another thing that happened was the U.S. Department of Energy, through the Argonne National Laboratories, did their own study confirming that engines were consuming 1 gallon of diesel per hour. The TMC, the Maintenance Council division of the ATA, opened a task force study on idling. So suddenly the numbers were real. And everybody was, sort of these confirming what we all believed and knew but now you could see it in the real numbers.
Yeah, it's on everyone's radar now, right? You've got task force behind it versus just fleet management guys trying to make sense of it.
Right. And then the other big thing that happened in 2005 was that Thermo King introduced its tri-pack.
Gotcha.
Timing is everything in life.
Yes.
They nailed it, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. So that was a big moment. And so this was now beginning. Thermo King, the name was answering the distribution question that we hadn't looked forward. It was giving us certainly a level of comfort to owner-operators and fleets. At that point, they already had 60 years of experience in small diesel engines through the development of their reefers and through the refrigerant Freon cycle. They already had great know-how on sort of best maintenance practices. And also they took a different approach. At that time, most of the APUs were continuous run APUs.
Right.
So they were diesel engines driving a generator, 120-volt generator, that was powering electric components, air conditioning, heating components. But Thermo King had already been involved in the development of what they call cycle century.
Right.
And that's only turning the refrigeration unit on and off when it's required. I mean, it doesn't need to run all the time. And since the price of diesel was quickly climbing to $3 and even $4 at that time, they started to focus on the idea that why would we, shouldn't we be turning off the APU if we don't really need it? And one of the neat approaches that they had was that they used a diesel air heater for heat for the sleeper.
Right.
And that product consumes 0.02 gallons of diesel per hour, right? So you can, when you mix that in with the fact that in the winter and in the summer and in the winter, you probably need to run your APU, but in the spring and the fall, when it's temperate outside, then there's going to be nights when you don't need to run the APU. You can just run the heater, or the APU might run a little bit to charge the batteries, right, sort of stuff. So this was a bit of a game changer in that we were now reducing the number of hours that the APU was running in it itself. So, we were rapidly approaching 0.3 of a gallon per hour. So if you think of when we started, 2 gallons per hour, now down to 0.3 of a gallon per hour.
And only when it's running, right?
And only when it's running, right? Yeah. So that was a very big year. And, I remember in I guess it was 2003, I went to the Mid-America Truck Show, and there were 16 manufacturers of APUs at the time.
So it caught on by that point.
Yeah, people were thinking that it was fairly easy to do and sort of learning as they went, like we did.
Yeah.
But by the time the two large refrigeration players got into it, the number dropped pretty good because the barrier to entry was significantly increased, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that kind of led up to 2005. And then, for the last, that's 15 years ago. I mean, it took us 15 years, it's 18 years ago. It took us 15 years to get to the point, that moment in 2005. And the numbers, the estimated sales in 2007 were close to 50,000 APUs, So when things are right and conditions are right, it moves pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, by having something like Thermo King behind it, you get that serviceability across North America. So now fleets are a bit more advantageous to look into, where it made sense maybe, when you guys were starting up. But again, for a national fleet, especially in the States, you got, guys that cover all 50 states, right? I guess, or 48. Yeah. So having, a big company behind it, helps really bring on the adaptation of it, right? You less risk, like as you look at all the OEMs they deal with on the truck side, they're across North America, right? So now you have another platform you're going to bolt onto this vehicle, but again, it's North America based, so it's not as risky. You feel a little more comfort. So obviously that definitely would help, bring the volume up pretty quick, because now you got fleets coming on board, not maybe just owner operators who see the value from their cost. Now a fleet can actually make sense of it and it's tangible for them. Absolutely.
I think there's when you talk about the truck refrigeration industry and, groceries and frozen foods and, pharmaceuticals, things like that, there's a sense of urgency around keeping that equipment operable.
Right.
That, kind of shadows a little bit that of the Coast Guard. It's not life and death, but it's getting close in some instances, right? Certainly saw it through the pandemic with the opportunity to, we continued to work, and it was fairly important to transport vaccines and that sort of stuff. And Thermo King played a pretty strong role in that worldwide to get that stuff out. So the idea of mission ready and, it being, you need to be ready for duty has never really left the program, and it's always been a part of the program, I think. And so cogeneration and the idea of, making sure that your main asset is ready to go is a pretty strong point today still.
Yeah, no, good point. And the mission ready is the one big piece, but obviously, the efficiency of these compared, like you've already talked to, but that keeps getting pushed and pushed, especially on the truck side, right? So you have things like CARB and EPA standards that are dictating what trucks can and can't do. And obviously now an APU helps, take some pressure off the vehicle in certain situations.
So, I mean, the industry hasn't stood still since 2005, right? Through that period of time, there have been a lot of tweaks and additions, and some of the things that we're seeing now, for instance, are solar panels. Solar panels are now reducing the runtime of the APU by another 30% based on the testing that Thermo King's been doing. And, so now you're down 0.2. So, it's a factor of 10 that we reduced it by. But as you mentioned, there are laws being passed and legislation is changing all the time. It's difficult to sort of keep an idea on it because it can be pretty tough read sometimes. But, 2024, calendar year 2024, the EPA and CARB are going to be mandating that an APU have a DPF. And those are not cheap.
Right.
And, they're complicated pieces of equipment. We've had a 10-year run at it. So Thermo King, I should say, has been working on it. So we feel pretty strong about the quality of the DPF that we're putting on. It's considerably smaller in size than it has been in the past.
Gotcha.
But it's an expense. And, I think probably there'll be an element of folks that want to move towards battery-powered solutions because they don't need a DPF there.
Right.
But that also brings up more questions, right? And the questions are, how are these batteries going to work in the extremes of North America? Will they function? The word on the street, at least these days, is that there's some difficulties in extreme heat and extreme cold.
Right.
And, what's going to happen when you're with your 30-hour layover, when you talk about hours of service, right?
Yeah.
You have a 270 amp alternator that needs to charge the batteries, but you have to run a certain number of hours to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's definitely segments of the market where that will work, folks that have, just run sort of regionally, that sort of stuff. But, always come back to the idea of being mission ready. And are you taking away from the batteries and your ability to start?
Right.
I've even heard that there are some applications now where they're going to combine a battery powered solution with turning the main engine back on.
Gotcha.
So if you get to a situation, get too low, the engine comes back on. Right. Maybe there's a sweet spot there. I don't know, but it just seems like a step backward to me to put the main asset back on,
That's a good point. That's the interesting thing, like what's next in the APU world, right? As far as like, what do you see? You kind of touched on it, but it's ever evolving, that's for sure. And regulations definitely drive kind of what to expect in the future, I assume.
They do. It's interesting. The government of Canada has just come out with their green fleet program, which is now making up to $10,000 available for a diesel APU. So that'll certainly help cover the cost of a DPF. And then some. So I think for all the reasons that you should buy an APU, you should still buy an APU because they're a good idea. When it comes to, that grant will also cover battery-powered solutions, and Thermo King offers both.
Gotcha.
And I think that we're going to see some major developments coming in the battery-powered solutions and improvements in battery. But, there's a lot of conversation around the number of drivers available. And, drivers want creature comforts of home when they're on the road. It's not an easy job.
True. They
want to make sure that they're mission ready, when that engine is going to turn over when they start in the morning, and still doesn't make a lot of sense to idle a big diesel. Yeah,
no, good point. And I'm nice surprised you guys are positioned well with both options. So I think I agree with you. I think regionally will drive kind of which which provider as far as, electric or diesel they go with. And we've seen it on the truck side too, right? There's a sweet spot for a battery electric vehicle versus, internal combustion. And I agree, that'll change as the technology gets better, as the infrastructure support it gets better. But I think you need both because, there are different circumstances, but it's good to know you're positioned well. But it's also interesting, if you look back to, the last 30 some odd years, to see where you started with this design, to see what it's turned into, and actually, same product down a different lane of being battery electric versus what you guys started with. It's it's interesting to branch off and become two basically products that, solve the same, it's not a problem, but, create the same purpose for you to be mission ready and have a vehicle ready to go, depending on kind of the external environments that are impacting it.
Yeah, when you listen to what the fleets are saying, and when you try to take a temperature, there's a lot of fleets saying they're having success with battery-powered solutions. And people that I work with here in southwestern Ontario are telling me they're having some success. Then there are other folks that say it's not working for them. So I think the two spaces are available.
Yep.
And the other thing I should mention is telematics are coming into play right now. So APUs will be having outfitted with telematics. So if it's going to give you access to more data, more things to evaluate about, whether that application is working for you or not.
Yeah, well, it helps validate the ROI for a lot of guys, but also, helps in the buying process, right? You try something this go around and it's either worked really well or it's the wrong application. But you have true data versus just, someone on the road saying it's not working, right? It takes away all the intangibles and gives you just pure data.
Yep, which is, really what changed the game when the electronic engines started to give us pure data.
Yeah.
It increased the market substantially. And I think telematics is going to tell the fleets, specifically whether it works in your application or not.
Fair. There's still a lot to look forward to for sure. Technology is ever changing. And I think, from what you were involved in and helped create, like it's a product that, I've always known about. It's always been there, but I didn't think I realized how close to home, one of the main people involved in getting it off the ground was to us, so it's cool to be able to talk to you and hear the story of how it came to light. And it totally makes sense when you get your marine background and you saw it in use and just transitioned to a different market. And like you said, time is everything with where things land, but it's a really cool story. It's a really cool history, and I'm glad you could share it with us. It's been great.
I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share it.
Excellent. Well, hey, that concludes today's episode, and I want to thank Al from Thermo King for joining us today. To catch up on past episodes, check out transportationexchangepodcast.ca. And until next time, thanks for listening.